Today's lecture is the gallery's annual Oswaldo Rodriguez Roque Memorial Lecture, honoring the memory and career of Oswaldo Rodriguez Roque, who graduated from Yale College in 1972 and received his MA from Yale in 1975. Oswaldo was the Associate Curator of American Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan Museum before being appointed the first Executive Director of the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He published widely on American painting and decorative arts, including American Furniture at Chipstone and Directions in American Painting, 1875 to 1925. Following his early death in 1990, a lectureship fund was endowed with a generous gift from the Chipstone Foundation and with contributions from friends, family, and colleagues. The Rodriguez family has been loyal attendees of these lectures, and we are honored to have a number of family members here with us tonight. And I might just say that today, November 1st, marks the 29th anniversary of Oswaldo's death. This afternoon's lecture is the keynote address for a symposium that will be held tomorrow, Mahogany, Species of Elegance, the History and the Science. Tonight's lecturer, the eminent English furniture historian, Adam Bowett, will provide an overview of the mahogany trade in the 18th and 19th centuries, setting the stage for tomorrow's exploration of this important commodity from the point of view of history and of science. For support of the scientific research undertaken collaboratively with Yale's Institution for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage, we thank the Wunsch Americana Foundation, and for support of tomorrow's symposium, we thank the Edward J. and Dorothy Clark Kempf Memorial Fund and the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. It's my pleasure now to turn it over to Patricia Kane, the Friends of American Art at Yale, Curator of American Decorative Arts, to introduce our distinguished speaker. Thank you.
Good evening. Adam Bowett is an independent furniture historian who resides in North Yorkshire, England. He received his PhD from Brunel University in 1997, where his thesis topic was the English mahogany trade, 1700 to 1793. His list of publications is really formidable, including English Furniture from Charles II to Queen Anne, that appeared in 2002, Early Georgian Furniture, published in 2009, and British Furniture Woods, 1400 to 1900, that came out in 2013. He has published numerous articles in scholarly journals, as well as pieces for more widely circulated publications like Antique Collecting, where a series of ongoing articles appeared under the heading Myths of English Furniture History, setting the record straight on such topics as the Great Frost of 1709 and the Walnut Famine, and Cuban mahogany, as well as an article, The Restoration Chest of Drawers, the Varnished and Unvarnished Truth. They all sound like wonderful reads that would not put you to sleep. He has also served as a consultant, lecturer, and advisor to numerous public and private bodies, including the Arts Council of England, the Addingham Trust, the National Trust, the Furniture History Society, and the Regional Furniture Society, to name but a few. Tonight, he revisits the topic of his dissertation in presenting mahogany, mapping the mahogany trade in the 18th and 19th century. Please join me in welcoming Adam Bowett.
Thank you, and good evening. It's a pleasure, a great pleasure, and a great honor to be here, particularly on this occasion. And I would like to thank Moline Theodore, Patricia Kane, and her colleagues at the University Art Gallery for inviting me to speak, and also for their work in putting together this symposium. It promises to be a stimulating and potentially groundbreaking couple of days. Now, mahogany is rightly celebrated as the world's best known, most widely used, and most commercially successful furniture wood. It was particularly significant for the decorative arts of Britain and North America in the 18th and 19th centuries, during which time it was by some distance the most important wood for high-status furniture making on both sides of the Atlantic. Indeed, it can be argued that mahogany virtually defined high-style British furniture from the second quarter of the 18th century onwards, and in North America, where native high-quality woods are more abundant, it was nevertheless highly significant. Its impact was dramatic, and its cultural impact also was very significant. Now, we know a lot about mahogany, but there's still much that we do not. And in particular, we have difficulty with identification. There are 3 recognized species of tropical American mahogany, but distinguishing between them is tricky, because although they're botanically distinct, their wood is so similar that it cannot reliably be differentiated by the normal means of microscopic analysis. Currently, broad assumptions about density, about color, and some microscopic features are used to arrive at identifications which really have no real basis, no real objective value. Mahogany is an amazingly variable wood, and in size, in color, in figure, density, and so on, and even wood from 2 trees from the same area, the same species, can be as unalike as 2 trees from different species and widely separated geographical locations. And while a great deal of work has been done on the genetic identity of existing mahogany populations, extracting usable samples of DNA from 200-year-old wood has so far proved unviable. Now, the reason the question of identity is important is that it can tell us so much more about our historic furniture. What kind of mahogany is it, and where did it come from? At the moment, we can only guess. The mythology of mahogany is laced with terms such as Cuban, or San Domingo, or Jamaica, or Honduras, and these imply geographical origin, but they rarely have any basis in proven fact. Most of this terminology is also anachronistic, most of it, I'd say, dating from the 19th and early 20th centuries, and they reflect the trade as it was then constituted and not as it was constituted historically. Accurate identification, if it can be achieved, will dispel these myths once and for all and provide a much truer picture of mahogany's role in furniture making on both sides of the Atlantic. Accurate identification is also the key to a very modern problem, which is the difficulty arising from the CITES agreements, which restrict trade in all 3 species of American mahogany, but to different degrees, depending on which species. Now, we'll return to this topic later, but first, my task is to give you an overview of the trade as it developed in the 18th and 19th centuries, based on what we can find out from documentary sources. Let's begin at the beginning with this map. It's a relatively old map. It's from Record and Hess, 1972, Timbers of the New World. And it shows the 3 species, the 3 recognized species of American tropical mahogany. And they are Swietenia mahogany, so-called West Indian or Cuban type, and that is indigenous to the West Indian Islands, to the southern tip of Florida, and to the Bahamas. Then we have Swietenia macrophylla, the so-called big leaf mahogany, called in the trade Honduras wood, Bay wood, Mexico mahogany, and so on. And that is indigenous to the eastern shore of Central America, facing onto the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. And finally, we have a 3rd species, Swietenia humilis, which, as far as we know, is restricted to the western coast of Central America, facing on to the Pacific. And I think it's as well to let you know what are the sources for my work on this, and to warn you that this is very much an Anglo-centric view. Most of my research has been done in UK archives. But having said that, nothing that I've seen in the American literature actually changes the picture substantially. The American trades and the British trades are very, very similar. The sources that are most important for the study of this trade are primarily government sources, beginning with the customs returns up at the top here. This is a resource, a record that survives from 1697 to the present day. It's a phenomenal resource, and it tells us what commodities were coming in from which places, at what date, and in what quantity. It's amazing. That gives us the broad picture. We can put some detail on that with colonial office records where they survive, and what are particularly important about these are the shipping returns for the various colonial ports, both in North America and in the West Indies. And from these we learn where the ships are coming from, what they're carrying, where they're going to. The Board of Trade correspondence is particularly useful in regard to the Honduras trade, because the Honduras trade was the subject of a lot of dispute between Britain and Spain, and consequently it generated a huge amount of government paperwork. Admiralty records, some of these are quite useful. Treasury records, also quite useful. But the individual port books, where they survive for English ports, also tell us about where the ships are coming from, what they're bringing, and in what quantities. Outside the government record, which gives us, shall we say, the official picture, the most important source by far is the Gillow archive. It's the most phenomenal furniture history archive ever. And the detail is phenomenal. It's particularly important because Gillows were directly involved in the mahogany trade with the West Indies. They were ship owners and traders. And the Gillow record gives us wonderful detail with which to flesh out the broad picture given by the government record. The Gillow archive tells us what they were buying, where they were buying it from, how much they were paying, how much it cost to ship it, and what they thought about it and how they used it. There are some regional business archives, particularly for firms trading with the West Indies, and there are also individual cabinet makers' records, bills, and so on, where they mention types of wood, cost, and so on. So there's a fair range of sources, and these together make up the picture that I'm going to show you. And I think it's worth starting with a very familiar image. You've seen images like this, I'm sure, many times before, of the so-called triangular trade as it was constituted in the 18th century. But it's worth putting it up, even though it's familiar, to ask a simple question: why was mahogany imported? It's not so obvious as it may seem, and certainly furniture making had very little to do with it. Essentially, the triangular trade is a mercantilist model whereby manufacturers are sent out from the home country to the colonists buy the manufacturers, and to pay for them in return, they send back raw materials, which are then regenerated into further manufactures. And the whole thing is underpinned, of course, by slave labor from West Africa, particularly in respect of the sugar islands in the Caribbean and in the tobacco colonies and the middle colonies of North America. Now, the problem with this model is that it didn't work very well, certainly not at the beginning of the 18th century. And the chief difficulty was there was too much shipping. There was an oversupply of shipping in the Atlantic, which meant there were more ships than freight. And this was particularly acute in respect of the sugar colonies and, to a lesser extent, the tobacco colonies, because these were both crops which were relatively unreliable in terms of how much was produced year to year. And so a shipper leaving Great Britain for the colonies would not know before he set out what he could expect when he got there. And he might arrive, for instance, at Kingston, Jamaica, to load sugar and find there'd been a bumper crop that year. He could fill his ship, all the traders could fill their ships, and they would go home fully loaded. Everybody would make money. But he might arrive in Kingston, Jamaica, and find the crop had fallen short, in which case he's scratching around for trade, he's competing with other traders, and he might have to come home part freighted or even empty. And in those circumstances, he's losing money. And so the shippers went to the government and said, what we need is some kind of staple, some kind of standby that we can carry, that we can put in our ships when the more lucrative cargoes are lacking. The government was persuaded by the arguments, and that's why they passed this act, the Naval Stores Act of 1721. And it is this act that initiated mahogany as an article of commerce in the 18th century. And it removed import duty on all woods from British colonies in the Americas and in the Caribbean. The chief target was actually the pines and so on of the northern states, northern colonies rather, but mahogany was also included. The effect was really quite dramatic. This graph shows you the value of mahogany imported between 1710 and 1740, and you can see that for the first 10 years or so, nothing much is happening. Almost no mahogany is shipped. And then suddenly from 1721 onwards, we begin to see substantial and increasing quantities of mahogany imported year on year. And this is just the beginning of a very, very large trade. I should point out that this is a graph of value, and all the 18th century graphs show value. But the customs officers used a standard valuation of £8 per tonne of mahogany. And so there is a direct correlation between value and quantity. It never changed throughout the 18th century. So almost £16,000 worth of mahogany here is nearly 2,000 tonnes of mahogany. So where was this wood coming from? This is a map of the arrangements of the European powers in Central America and the West Indies in the middle of the 18th century, the territorial distribution, and it shows us that Spain is undoubtedly the dominant power so far as territory is concerned. The whole of Central America, northern coast of South America, and particularly the island of Cuba and the eastern half of Hispaniola. As well as Spain, France is doing pretty well, and particularly this is an important territory for the French, a great producer of cotton. They had two very lucrative sugar islands here, Martinique and Guadeloupe. Britain, on the other hand, is not too well situated. It has the scattered islands of the Bahamas, it has some of these small islands in the Antilles here, and it has Jamaica. And Jamaica, for the period that we're looking at, remained the center of British naval, military, and commercial operations in the Caribbean. Now, this relatively small amount of territory controlled by the British produces a number of problems, a couple of important problems, really. And the first is that if you are depending on raw materials, if you are extracting raw materials and not replacing them, sooner or later, on a small island like Jamaica, you're going to run out. And that's exactly what happened with mahogany. The second problem is that if you want to replace those materials or find alternative sources, you're inhibited by the other foreign powers in the region, because every power operated a restrictive trading zone and essentially discouraged trade between the possessions of other nations. So Jamaica did not legally trade with Cuba, Cuba did not legally trade with Saint Domingue, and so on. So each power operated a mutually exclusive trading system, and breaking these trading systems is really the key to expanding the trade. There is no question that for the first 50 years or so of the trade, Jamaica is the key to the British mahogany trade, as this graph shows. Mahogany came from all the British territories in the Caribbean, and they're shown by the red line, but the produce of Jamaica is shown by the blue line, and in some years, as you can see, the two lines are the same. Over the period between 1720 and 1770, those 50 years, more than 90% of the timber, the mahogany timber imported into England, came from that one island. Now, there's a certain amount of argument about how much of it actually grew there, but as we shall see, I think the assumption is fair that at this period, most of it grew on Jamaica. This is just an indication of the sort of ships and the sort of cargoes they were carrying in this trade to Kingston, Jamaica. You can see the ships are really quite small. 60 tons is a very small ship in which to cross the Atlantic, typically between 100 and 200 tons. The cargoes in every case are predominantly sugar. That's where the money is. That's where the money is earned. Sugar byproducts, rum. Then we have cotton, dyewoods such as fustic and logwood. And finally, we have mahogany. And this tells us a couple of things. First of all, it tells us that mahogany is doing the job the government wanted it to do and the shippers wanted it to do, which is it's helping to fill up the ship. It's helping to complete the loading. So it's about the economics of shipping. But it's also telling us that mahogany is way down the pecking order in terms of value. And other cargoes are more lucrative, and where they're available, they will be carried first. And indeed, one shipper actually went on record as saying he regarded mahogany as the cargo of dernier resort, of last resort. So it's not a great money earner. From what we've seen so far, we might therefore assume that when we look at London furniture, particularly high-quality London furniture of the middle of the 18th century, we are looking at Jamaica mahogany. And certainly furniture like this fulfills, in terms of its character, what we think Jamaica mahogany should be. It's dark, it's hard, it's dense, it carves beautifully, and so on. But actually, we've no real way of knowing yet. And it's difficult even to determine whether this is even the right species of mahogany, whether this is West Indian mahogany and not some other kind of mahogany. So the assumption is there, our ability to prove that assumption is yet to come. Furthermore, the picture is more nuanced than first appears. So here we have a graph which shows the total of mahogany importations into England in the blue line, and the contribution of the North American colonies in the red line. So these are re-exports from North American colonies. So the timber has come from the Caribbean to North America and is coming now into England. And this shows that the American colonies are major players in the trade. They're part of the whole trading system, and that's vital to understand. And in any given year between 1720 and 1780, they are supplying between 0 and 30% of the mahogany timber to the British market. If we look more closely at these figures, we come up with some rather surprising data. So this pie chart shows us the percentage of mahogany from each of the regions of North America as recorded in British customs. And the surprising thing to me is the contribution of South Carolina, almost 50% of the total. And when we're speaking about South Carolina, we're really speaking about one port, which is the port of Charleston. So Charleston is a really, really big player in this re-export trade. The other major suppliers, New England, New York and Philadelphia, these are perhaps more predictable. We can use the shipping records from the Colonial Office to drill down into that picture and be more specific about the sources of mahogany for these various places. So this is from the Jamaica shipping returns, and it shows us vessels going out from Kingston to North America over this period in the 1740s. And you can see that they're carrying mahogany planks, and they're exclusively going to the northern and middle colonies: Rhode Island, Philadelphia, Boston, Virginia, and New York. If, however, we turn our gaze further south and we look at the port of Charleston, and in this case we're looking at goods inwards into Charleston, we can see that Charleston gets almost all its mahogany from one place, and that is New Providence in the Bahamas. And that explains the dual terminology. Madeira and mahogany are synonymous. Madeira is the Bahamian name for mahogany. And so it looks as though the North American market is maybe split into two. So you have Jamaica mahogany going principally to the middle and northern colonies, and you have Bahamas mahogany going to the southern colonies. Well, that's what the picture seems to show, at least the evidence seems to show. Does that mean that we can legitimately hypothesize about American furniture? For instance, on the left-hand side, this Charleston piece, can we assume that this is Bahamas mahogany? Well, we might assume it on the basis of the evidence we've just seen. Can we prove it? Well, probably not just yet. Can we assume that this Rhode Island piece is of Jamaica wood? It ought to be, given the documentary record, but again, proving it is another matter. And I think also we ought to bear in mind some serious caveats here. First of all, what is the extent of the intercolonial trade up and down the East Coast? How much of that Charleston wood is getting shipped further north? That's something we need to bear in mind. And secondly, it's a fact that the North American shippers were a lot more willing to take on speculative voyages throughout the Caribbean. And so they are calling at places that a lot of English shippers don't go. And mahogany from those places is probably ending up in North America. But it's very, very difficult to track down. So as always, it's a simple picture which gets more complicated when you drill down into the detail. Alternative sources of mahogany were needed fairly early on, and they became available from the 1740s. And these were initially in Central America. And the first source to come on stream, if we can call it that, is from the Mosquito Shore. Now these days the Mosquito Coast is here, it's on the coast of Nicaragua, but in the 18th century the Mosquito Coast, or the Mosquito Shore, was actually up here on the northern coast of Honduras. And the trade was centered on this island of Roatan. What happened was that during the war against Spain, 1739 to 48, the British occupied and fortified this island and used it as a base from which to trade into Central America and elsewhere in the Caribbean. And they also settled on the shore itself. So this detail of a 1770s map shows you the island of Roatan here, and it shows you also the English settlements around the mouth of the Black River, and this is where the mahogany came from, up to 200,000 feet per annum from 1745 until 1787, when the settlements were evacuated. This was known in the trade as rattan wood, but in fact it's very, very difficult to find in British furniture. I've only found 2 references to rattan wood in furniture makers' records. Maybe they were embarrassed about it because this wood was lower quality, about half the value of Jamaica wood, but it came from very big trees, so you've got wide boards. It was light in weight, as one put it, ideal for making coach panels of. And maybe, therefore, rattan mahogany is hidden in pieces like this. This organ case, constructed in 1757, the lower part of the case has these broad panels of mahogany coming from a big tree, relatively lightweight, relatively pale in color once you get behind the patination. Maybe this is rattan mahogany. Hasn't been tested, so at the moment we don't know. We don't even know what species it is. But compared to rattan, mahogany from Honduras was a much, much more serious commercial article. Now, it's important to understand this is all Spanish territory. So the British are operating here, initially at least, illegally. And they've been cutting wood in this area here, Belize, around the mouth of the Belize River, since the 1670s, maybe earlier. But they're not cutting mahogany. They are cutting logwood, which is the single most important dyewood for the markets of North America and Europe. The Spanish repeatedly tried to eradicate the logwood cutters in their works, and during the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63, they very nearly succeeded. And there was a dearth of logwood on the market, and the prices were sky high. When peace was signed in 1763, the British persuaded the Spanish to let the logwood cutters return within certain limits. And that's the pink area here. This is the limits agreed with the Spanish for cutting logwood, not mahogany, logwood. Consequently, the logwood cutters returned. They cut so much logwood, the price in Europe collapsed. And so there was a glut on the market. The cutters in Honduras had nothing, had piles of logwood they couldn't sell. The shippers had empty ships in the bay with no cargo. At that point, they turned to mahogany. And the first recorded shipment of Honduras mahogany from this territory into Kingston, Jamaica, was the 10th of November, 1763. So we can really mark the beginning of the Honduras trade almost to the day. And it became really the most significant trade from Central America until the middle of the 19th century. Because of the disputes between Britain and Spain over this territory, it's very well documented and it's also well mapped. So here we have a map of 1787 produced by a bayman. It's difficult for me to see. This is the Belize River, one of the 3 main cutting rivers. Here is the coast with the low-lying keys off coast. This is really treacherous waters, and the ships the ocean-going ships had to anchor way offshore. This is the Barcadères. This is the highest navigable point of the river for flat-bottom craft coming up from the coast. And the cutters are working inland here, and they're cutting mahogany in the interior. They're hauling it to the creeks and the lagoons. They're floating it down during the rainy season and collecting it at the Barcadères. Where are we? There we are. And then it's rafted all the way down and out to the ships in the bay. And we've got information such as, this is where the mahogany is, this is where the logwood is, and so on. And some of these maps are simply phenomenal. This map was produced by David Lamb. It's a hand-drawn map. It's not a printed map. And he was one of the surveyors that was appointed by the British government to survey the limits of British cutting territory when a further agreement was agreed in 1786. And this was the Convention of London. And for the first time, the Spanish agreed to let the British cut mahogany legally in this territory. In return, the British evacuated the Mosquito Shore and brought the cutters to this territory. So here we have on Lamb's map the 3 main cutting rivers, the Hondo, the New River, and the Belize River. And there's the most wonderful detail in this map. For instance, if we look here, we can see the names of the cutters, and some of these people are very big operators and became politically extremely important in the territory. People like O'Brien, for instance, well-known, well-documented people. And it also gives us information on who sold what to whom and that kind of thing. This detail, this shows us the activities of the Spanish. This is Major Bresson, and what he's doing is he's patrolling the limits and he's destroying the mahogany works that he finds on this side of the river. which are outside the agreed limits. So here he calls the oxen to be drove into the woods, and the houses and a number of large mahogany logs were burned. Here he burned the houses, destroyed the plantation, and seized several thousand feet of mahogany. And finally up here he burned 70 or 80 large logs of mahogany. So there's a wonderful amount of detail, and that in fact extends to the pictorial record. All the images are 19th century, such as this one, a lithograph of about 1830. But it shows us mahogany being cut in Honduras. You can see that the hard work is being done by slave labor. In the foreground, there's an overseer, a white overseer on his horse. Back here are two slaves. They are cross-cutting a felled mahogany tree to cut it into manageable lengths. Once it's been cross-cut, the timber is then squared in order to reduce weight and also to reduce shipping costs. And here we see a squared log being levered onto this truck. And these oxen, just coming into the picture, will be hitched up to the truck, and they will then take the mahogany to the nearest navigable, or rather the nearest river, to float it down to the nearest navigable point. So there's some wonderful detail that we can find out about this trade. Now, the advent of Honduras mahogany onto the market made a very big difference. And this graph shows some of what happened. The red line shows us the figures for Honduras mahogany, value of Honduras mahogany, none until 1763, and then a gradual increase in Honduras mahogany imported into England, rising steeply in the second half of that decade. Now, in this period, some of the importations are going via Jamaica, so probably some of this Jamaican wood here is actually Honduras wood. But increasingly, the trade was direct, which accounts for this very steep rise, and that created a problem, because this is Spanish territory, this is Spanish wood, it's foreign wood, and therefore it's liable to duty. And both the cutters and the shippers objected, and the government was persuaded and agreed with them, so they passed in 1771 the Mahogany Act, which allowed duty-free status to all mahogany from whatever source. This is the first act in British history, possibly the only act in British history, which specifically refers to the needs of the furniture industry and cabinet makers. The effect was to vastly accelerate the mahogany trade from Honduras, such that in 1772, the value of mahogany from Honduras exceeded that from Jamaica for the first time. It caused a short-term crash in the Jamaica trade, partly due to oversupply, partly because the Honduras wood cut out the poorer quality Jamaica wood, just took it out of the market. Both trades recover. From now on, the Honduras trade is always the bigger trade. And also from now on, from the mid-1770s, a lot of this apparently Jamaica wood is actually coming from foreign islands. Before we go on to discuss that, let's just finish the Honduras situation. And this is a map of a late 18th century map, and it shows us the limits of cutting agreed in the Convention of 1786. And the map maker has, in effect, assumed that this is already British territory, by the way he's coloured it. Technically it wasn't, but it did become so in due course. But by 1800, this map is already out of date, because we know British cutters are working way down south here, in as far south as the Saskatoon River. And it's that river that became the border of what would later to become the colony of British Honduras in Central America. We'll return to Central America in due course. But let's go back to the Caribbean and to the West Indian Islands and look at alternative sources of mahogany from there. As with the Honduras trade, the 7 Years' War was the key turning point in the fortunes of the trade in Caribbean mahogany. Britain ended that war in 1763 with almost complete military, naval, and commercial dominance in the Caribbean. And during the war, they had taken and occupied Havana, they had taken and occupied Guadeloupe and Martinique, and these captures had opened up to the British the potential, the commercial potential of the foreign colonies. And so policy underwent a sea change, and from now on, the British policy was increasingly towards freeing up and not restricting trade. And the first indication of this was the Free Ports Act of 1666. And this opened 4 ports on Jamaica and 2 on Dominica for the first time to foreign vessels bringing in foreign produce from foreign islands. Now, what the British were really interested in was cotton from this island here. Cotton was badly needed to supply the mills of Lancashire. This is the era when the Industrial Revolution was just gathering steam. And this was the largest cotton producer in the region. So San Domingo cotton was the target, but on the back of cotton came mahogany. The Jamaica shipping returns tell us quite clearly where this mahogany is coming from, and these are the main points of export. Important to note that it's all in the western half of the island, it's all in the French territory, and not, as far as we know at this date, in the eastern half of the island, which was occupied by Spain, and now is, of course, the Dominican Republic. That seems to be a 19th century phenomenon. So at the moment, it's all coming from this part of the island. It is nevertheless called Spanish mahogany, or Hispaniola wood, or San Domingo wood. It's all the same. It's three names for the same thing. This is where it's coming from. The Treasury also got interested in this trade, in monitoring this trade, maybe to find out how much tax they were losing. And these figures show us the key period really is the ending of the American War, the Revolutionary War, when the trade really bursts into life. And from the 1780s onwards, we can more or less assume that all the mahogany coming out of Jamaica originated elsewhere, and most of it originated in this one island of Hispaniola, particularly from the French colony of San Domingo. In theory, therefore, we ought to be able to follow the progress of these changes in the trade through the furniture. And the Gillow Archive is a great place to start because it is so comprehensive and there are so many documented pieces of furniture surviving. So here's a press of 1759. Actually, it makes rather an interesting stylistic progression, this as well. 1759, we ought to be pretty sure that this is going to be Jamaica wood. The Gillows tell us that this is why they're buying their Jamaica. They may be using rattan wood for backs, bottoms, secondary purposes. The middle of the 1760s, the picture is more complicated. They're still buying from the Jamaica, and they're buying from Honduras. But is the Jamaica wood really grown on Jamaica? We don't know. Gillows don't tell us at this date. By the time, however, we get to 1792, there is no question. There are only two sources of mahogany that interest British furniture makers, Gillows and others, and they are Honduras and San Domingo, and it's generally referred to as Spanish wood. So this press is made of Spanish mahogany and Honduras mahogany. Spanish mahogany is the higher quality wood for the show wood and for the high quality furniture. The Honduras wood is used for backs, sides, bottoms, and other secondary purposes. So the picture has radically changed between 1759 and 1792. The question is, can we actually prove this scientifically? Well, that's a question for tomorrow. Occasionally, we find pieces of furniture which are minutely specified, as in this bookcase. This is one of a set that was made for Tatton Park in Cheshire, 1811. One of the most interesting things about this is they're using a wood from Brazil, Venatico. It's not mahogany, it's a mahogany-like wood, and they're sourcing wood from Brazil in 1811. As far as mahogany is concerned, this bookcase is made of Spanish wood, and the specification tells us that the sides are made of bay wood. In other words, Honduras mahogany. Theoretically, we ought to be able to go to pieces of furniture like this and use these as a check against our scientific analyses, see what that tells us. It's just worth, I think, pointing out what happens to the United States after 1783 in respect to the mahogany trade. And I think the short answer to this is not a great deal. Sure, the re-export trade now moves north to Canada and cuts out the American states. US trade with British colonies is now much more restricted because the US is operating as a foreign power and is treated as such. And this causes the US to shift its attention elsewhere to Cuba, but in respect to mahogany, particularly to Hispaniola, San Domingo, call it what you will. British vessels, however, are still trading as usual, and they're bringing wood into American ports. And importantly, the US vessels are still allowed to trade directly with Belize, Honduras. So I think in sum, not a great deal has happened. Not a great deal has changed. It's more of the same, and the picture looks very like the picture we find in Great Britain. Theoretically, we ought to be able to follow these changes, again, through American furniture. In this case, we have examples from Rhode Island, mid-1750s. This, according to the documentary record, should be Jamaica wood. Mid-1775, this is going to be a more mixed picture. This bookcase, this desk and bookcase caught my eye because of the colour of the wood. It's a golden coloured mahogany, I suspect relatively lightweight, and it has the characteristics, the features that we might associate with Honduras wood. Whether it is Honduras wood or not, I don't know, but maybe the science will be able to tell us. And by the 1790s, the North Americans are using exactly the same wood as the British. They're using principally Spanish or San Domingo mahogany for quality work, and bay wood or Honduras wood for the rest. Let's now look at the 19th century and begin with this graph, which shows the overall picture for importations into Great Britain. And it shows us that the trade peaked in the mid-1770s at just over 80,000 tons per annum. This is a vast, vast quantity of wood. And interestingly, there's a sudden collapse immediately thereafter. Now, there are two reasons for this. One is oversupply of the market, quite simply. Supply and demand, but the other reason is that this is the period when mahogany from Africa, so-called mahogany from Africa, first hits the British market and the European market. This is not true mahogany, it's a related genus, the genus Kaya, a number of species in West Africa, and this is the point at which it becomes a significant factor in the overall timber trade, and its effect on the American mahogany trade, the trade in American mahogany is quite marked. The general picture in the 19th century is one of expansion and diversification, and this begins in the 1790s and early 1800s during the wars between Britain and France, when conquest, military conquest, is the key to opening up new territory. So we find, for instance, mahogany from Trinidad appearing on the British record in 1801. Mahogany doesn't actually grow in Trinidad. So this didn't come from Trinidad itself. Trinidad is an entrepot, is a supermarket for goods from all over South America and the Caribbean. Similarly, the Dutch colonies of Curaçao, of Demerara and Suriname, these were taken by the British, and mahogany was coming from all these territories in relatively small quantities, possibly not sourced there, possibly sourced elsewhere, but this is where the ships set out from. The really important, well, there is Puerto Rico in 1822. This is the first mention I've got of wood from this. Whoa, that's an interesting phenomenon. The first mention I've got of wood from this territory, and I'm not sure that the mahogany is indigenous to Puerto Rico, so where it's coming from, I don't know. But the really important development is Central America. The collapse of the Spanish Empire from the 1820s onwards allowed all these different parts of the former Viceroyalty of New Spain to become independent, to take more or less their present form. And one by one, these become independent producers of mahogany to the British and the North American markets, beginning with Guatemala, Mexico. This is an isolated shipment of 1828. We'll come back to that. Colombia down here, and then after 1850, all of these Central American states are entering into the trade. This shows us the main players in the trade in the 19th century. By this time, the British West Indies is a negligible quantity. The Americans, similarly, although there's a sudden resurgence in the 1890s, don't quite know what that's about. But the most of the good quality mahogany is this red line here, and this is coming from the foreign West Indies. This is almost all Hispaniola and Cuban wood. Honduras is doing very, very well, supplies the bulk of the mahogany to the market until the second half of the 19th century. And in the 19th century, the really important development is the advent of Mexico, this purple line, onto the stage. Mexico is, in the second half of the 19th century, the single most important source of mahogany in the world, and its exportations exceed all the others put together. It's a complex picture. So when we look at a piece of furniture like this, unlike a piece of furniture of a century earlier, it's anybody's guess as to where this wood is coming from. In theory, if we believe what the cabinet makers tell us, they're using Cuban or San Domingo wood for the veneers and for the high quality stuff. But by this time, they're almost just trade terms. Very difficult to tell where the wood is actually coming from. For the secondary wood, for the bed of the table, for instance, and other purposes, could be from anywhere in Central America or even South America. A very complicated picture. Furthermore, we must always be vigilant. We must be careful about believing the figures. And as we all know, there are lies, there are damn lies, and then there are government figures. And this is government figures. It shows in the 1830s a sudden collapse in the Hispaniola trade and a corresponding rise in the Bahamas trade. Well, this ain't happening. This is tax evasion. And what happened was that the British in 1833, for some reason, the British government decided it was a good idea to put a high duty on foreign mahogany and a corresponding light duty on Bahamas mahogany. So all the shippers did is they rerouted their Hispaniola mahogany through the Bahamas. And this is the effect. 1837, they realized what a dumb idea it was, and they repealed the act, and it all went back to normal. This shows us the relative contributions of Haiti and Cuba. And when we talk about Haiti, or rather when the British customs talk about Haiti, they mean the whole island, not just the French half, which is now the Republic of Haiti. They mean what is now Haiti and also what is now the Dominican Republic. And it's annoying because it means we can't differentiate the two. The figures is a global figure for the whole island. Nevertheless, it shows us that in the first half of the 19th century, Haiti is the principal supplier in the blue column, the blue line of quality mahogany to the market. And from the 1840s, Cuban wood begins to take over, and in the second half of the 19th century, it is Cuba which is the dominant player. And indeed, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that by the end of the 19th century, Haiti is a spent force. The best stuff is pretty much logged out by the beginning of the 20th century. Now, I mentioned Mexico. So Mexico is really, really important, and this is where the mahogany is coming from. This is the coast of Mexico facing onto the Gulf. And there are two principal states involved. There's Tabasco here and Veracruz here. 6 main ports, as you can see from right to left here. And they're all associated with rivers or lagoons to give them access to the timber that's in the interior. The most important of these, well, is probably Frontera, but this is an interesting port here. This is Minatitlan. This was established as a royal arsenal in the middle of the 18th century by the Spanish. It's 30 miles upstream, but navigable from the Gulf. And this was to supply mahogany for the Spanish Navy, for Spanish warships. When the Spanish Empire collapsed, the trade fell into desuetude, as did the royal arsenal. But from the 1840s again, it picked up again and became a major player in the trade. Now, I want to conclude by considering the CITES problem. This photograph, this pair of photographs is an instructive comparison. On the left-hand side here, we see an old photograph of 1911 from Central America, showing Swietenia macrophylla, big leaf mahogany, in its natural habitat. And down here, you will see a representative of the logging company. And now it becomes apparent why they photographed this tree. It's a massive tree. Admittedly, not all mahogany trees grow this big, but gives you some idea of what these trees could achieve in the right conditions, right soil and climate and so on. And probably we've got 60 feet between the top of the buttress and the first branch here, 60 feet of clear timber, maybe 5 or 6 feet in diameter, the best furniture wood in the world. And this is why commercially this thing was so important. On the right-hand side is a more recent photograph of Swietenia mahogany, the West Indian, Cuban type so-called, growing on the island of Barbados. And these trees are quite different. They're small, they're crooked, and they're quite unlike the mahogany of the 18th century. The fact is that the logging of the 19th and the 18th centuries was so extensive and so complete that the whole genome of this species has changed. It is no longer the tree it was 2 centuries ago. A Yale-based study of, I think, 2003 concluded, and I quote, that all 3 species of mahogany were considered commercially extinct throughout their ranges. And consequently, this is why all tropical American mahogany is now protected under the CITES agreements. They're all 3 of them listed under CITES 2. And CITES 2 means that they're considered endangered to the extent that trade must be controlled to preserve the species. Now, until recently, this hasn't bothered the field of historic furniture studies, nor has it really bothered the antiques trade. And routinely, mahogany furniture is shipped across the Atlantic in both directions. However, governments in Central America and on both sides of the Atlantic are becoming more concerned. And the species that they're really concerned about is Swietena humilis, which grows on the west coast of Central America. Now, the reason they're concerned about this is that the listing is slightly different, because the other two species can be freely traded in manufactured form. So if you've got antique furniture made of mahogany from Honduras or from Cuba, that's fine, you can trade it. But the CITES listing of the third species, Swietena humilis, says it refers to all parts and derivatives without limitation of time. So anything made from it is controlled under this CITES listing. And it cannot be traded without a license. Now, the application of this specific listing to this specific species has not really bothered the trade so far, and it's not been very rigorous, because the trade, I'm talking about the antiques trade, can always say, well, that doesn't matter because we know that our mahogany is all of either Swietena mahogany and Swietena macrophylla, and the third species, Swietena humilis, grows in areas that were not accessible to loggers in the 18th and 19th centuries. And this map, which is a recent map of 2000, seems to give credence to that assumption, lends it support, because it shows us the distribution of the two Central American species. Here in the dark green, we have the distribution of Swietena macrophylla, Honduras mahogany, big leaf mahogany, and so on. And then here in the cross-hatched pink area, we have the distribution of Swietena humilis, this third species that everybody is so concerned about. And they are broadly separated by this range of mountains that runs down the center of Central America and forms a really formidable geographical barrier, both to logging activities coming in from the coast and also to the spread of plants. In this area, low-lying area, there's considerable hybridization between the two species, as the two colors show. But nevertheless, according to this map, Swietena humilis, the species that everybody's concerned about, is not or should not be in areas accessible to loggers in the 18th and 19th centuries. However, work initiated here at Yale and also in other institutions seems to challenge this comfortable assumption. And that's why we're all here. Because not only does this work promise to distinguish for the first time reliably between the three species of mahogany, but initial results suggest that Swietena humilis does indeed occur in American furniture of the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, if this proves to be the case, the implications are potentially far-reaching. And it also means something is wrong with the mahogany story as we know it. Either there's a piece missing from the jigsaw, something we don't know, or the botanists need to reevaluate the way they identify the three species of mahogany, or at least some of what I've been telling you in these past 50 minutes is complete nonsense. And I can't wait to find out which it is. Thank you very much for listening. Do we have time for questions? Sure. Yeah, happy to take questions for a few minutes if anybody has any. Right word.
Yes, the last graph you showed looked like noise. Is that an artifact of the data, or is that for real?
Is this the graph you're referring to? That's for real. One of the things that is common to all the graphs I showed is that they're very volatile. They're up and down and up and down. This is a striking feature of the mahogany trade, and there are all kinds of reasons for it. Would you like me to expand on that? First of all, it depends on the market price. When the market is glutted, nobody wants to ship mahogany because they can't sell it. And so you get these periods of feast and famine. And this is exacerbated by the condition of war and peace, because during wartime, the trade drops and the market gets starved, prices go up, and there you get a sudden glut of resupply after the war. prices shoot up, and then you get a collapse. And this is a familiar pattern. The other thing is that the volatility relates to mahogany's place in the pecking order of commodities. Because if there's a good sugar crop that year, nobody's going to bother to carry mahogany. Conversely, if the sugar falls short, they're going to carry a lot of mahogany. So there are a lot of variables, and this accounts for this very erratic looking graph, which is just a standard feature of the trade. Okay. Any other questions? There's one just down here. Yeah, that's you. Do you want to wait for the microphone?
It's not really a fully formed question.
I know how you feel.
But so initially, mahogany is being used as ballast, then, essentially.
Not in the sense. Ballast helps the ship sail better. So ballast is things that are really heavy, like stones or iron, and you put it in the bottom of the ship, and it keeps the ship upright. Mahogany floats. So in that sense, it's not ballast, but it is ballast in the sense that it's making up the cargo. It's something you load up when everything else is loaded, and you've still got a bit of room.
And is Gillows documented as being peripherally involved in the actual slave trade?
I have not found any evidence for it.
Were
In fact, most of the West Indies trade was just across the Atlantic. It was a two-way trade, or sometimes three-way from Britain, West Indies, North America, and back. The slave trade tended to be quite specialized and pretty risky. And so Gillows was certainly involved. I mean, they shipped sugar, for instance. They were part ship owners, and they certainly worked with and for slave traders. But I have not found any evidence that Gillows were trading to to West Africa. All their journeys seem to go direct to the West Indies.
What was mahogany used for in this period as a specific naval store, as opposed to, for example, furniture?
The short answer is it wasn't. It was an incidental beneficiary of the naval stores legislation. Naval stores means white pine for masts, it means pine for decking, it means hemp for rope, tar, this kind of stuff. Mahogany timber was not used by the Royal Navy until well into the 19th century for a number of reasons, mostly prejudice. On the other hand, it was very widely used by the Spanish. And where the British captured Spanish vessels, they used them. So a proportion of the British Navy in the 18th and 19th centuries was, in fact, of mahogany ships, but they were not British built.
Mahogany was used like oak?
Exactly, it was used in the hull timber. And in fact, there are accounts of Spanish vessels having been drafted into Royal Navy service, eventually ending up in the breaker's yard in the middle of the 19th century, and the ships are being broken up and the wood is being sold off to furniture makers. There's one there. Yep, that's you. Yep.
Is there an active market today for mahogany?
Well, the market is problematic because the trade in mahogany timber is controlled by CITES. And the problem is that all mahogany timber now, in theory, should have a license, and it needs to be from areas which are controlled and regulated. I think this is a question that is better asked tomorrow when we have some, or unless you'd like to comment, Katie?
There are a number of concessions in
Yeah.
Central America that are developing,
Yeah.
specifically for Symposium.
So, in other words, the areas that are commercially logged are concessions. They're legal concessions with licenses. But I think it's fair to say the concern is really about illegal logging, is it not? And this is where the work in terms of genetic identity or other forms of identifying is so important. It's nice for us historians to understand these things, but it's absolutely vital for scientists to understand it, because if they don't, then the mahogany and other species run the risk of going extinct. Any more questions, or is everybody keen for a drink? I know I am.
You spoke about Santo Domingo mahogany
Yeah.
and Jamaican mahogany.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if they weren't the same species, and if
They-
they were, what makes them so different?
They are the same species. Absolutely, they're both Sweetania mahogany. And in theory, they are not, at least what the cabinet makers tell us, is that they're not different. So when the change began to happen, the first record I have in an English cabinet maker's source, as opposed to shipping records, of mahogany from San Domingue, from Hispaniola being used, is in 1768. And what Gillows say, and this is Gillows' archive, they're buying their mahogany through Jamaica, and they're always telling their factors, their suppliers, they're saying, we want right Jamaica wood. That's what they want. They don't want any mosquito rubbish. They want right Jamaica wood. And they write to the supplier and they say, the last stuff you sent us was extremely good. We think it might come from Hispaniola. And this is the first indication that Gillows are buying wood from Jamaica, which originates in Hispaniola. Now, the reason that Gillows liked it is because it was the nearest thing they could get to the Jamaica wood, which was becoming so difficult to obtain. So the quality of San Domingo and the quality of Jamaica wood are, from what we understand, equivalent. And once the Jamaica wood had all gone, it was the San Domingo wood that did that job. And whether it'll be possible in the future to identify woods within the same species, as in San Domingo and Jamaica, but from different islands, I mean, that would be wonderful. That would completely revolutionize the picture. There was one more over there, yeah. If we can hear you, yeah.
Yes, could you speak to the marketing techniques that were used during the 1720s and 30s to help increase the value and desirability of mahogany?
In the early period, it wasn't necessary because there was only... Furniture makers don't start being fussy about where the wood is coming from or what it's called until alternative sources appear. So it's not until the 1740s and 50s when rattan wood enters the market that they need to discriminate. And this is why when Gillows talk about right Jamaica wood, they're doing it because there's now alternative sources on the market. Before that, the phrase would have been redundant because it's all Jamaica wood, given that there's a certain amount, we don't quite know how much of Bahamas mahogany. So the labeling of the wood is a phenomenon of competition with once different sources come on stream. Now, as far as I know, and you may have evidence to the contrary, but wood was not marked in terms of its quality or its origin. The only marks that I have record of being put on wood are marks of ownership and measurement. Is this something that you've researched that changes that or adds to that?
From the French perspective, not the British, unfortunately.
Well, please do tell.
So in 1806, there is a publication that's created, I'm trying to think of the exact name of it, but it's essentially a social guide to the preferred species of wood to be using, which would at that point be indigenous species rather than importing mahogany.
Uh-huh.
That was amassed to basically cover up trade problems that were going on, trying to help the furniture industry and
Right.
makers.
Right. Exactly. The French couldn't get any mahogany effectively, so they made a virtue out of necessity and said, we're all using French woods from now on. Well, tough. They didn't have any choice. Yeah, the whole thing about, I mean, now there are, in the 20th century, there are something like 60 or 80 woods traded as mahogany. So the cachet of the name spread without a doubt. But in the early days, it really wasn't an issue. One more, I'm told. So I can see, can we speak afterwards? I think because the microphone's at the back there. Go ahead.
Could you mention any specific city or place in Cuba from which mahogany was cut?
I haven't done a great deal of work on the Cuba trade. The first mahogany that I have record of comes out of Havana. And this is because the British occupied the port of Havana in 1762, but they went no further. Now, where that Havana wood, and it was called in the trade Havana wood, where that Havana wood actually came from, we don't know. Obviously not from within the city, but probably from somewhere in the hinterland. Later on, when Havana was returned to the Spanish and Cuba was more or less closed again, we find small vessels going from the northern shore of Jamaica into the southern shore of Cuba. And they're going into small ports, and maybe not even ports, maybe beaches and coves, and they're bringing off Cuban goods far away from the authorities in Havana, bringing it off these beaches and taking it into North Jamaica. So the first shipments after Havana seem to be coming from the eastern and southern end of the island. But there's really very little good information. That's all I can tell you at the moment, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Go on then, yeah. Last one, please.
Right now, in local lumber yards, you could go and try to buy mahogany. And from what I understand of your lecture, none of the three Sweetenia types would be what they're offering. But they are using kaya and they're using entandrophragma woods, and they're labeling them as something or other mahogany, something or other mahogany. Is it your opinion that that's ever an appropriate use of the term mahogany, or should mahogany be restricted to the three ones that you've been talking about?
Well, it's marketing, isn't it? Is it appropriate or is it correct? No. Is it inevitable? Yes. It would be nice if traders were a little bit more honest about what they were selling. Whether there's any legislation that we can compel them to do so, I don't know. As I say, 60 or 80 species were traded as mahogany. You can still buy mahogany. I bought some mahogany about this time last year. Good mahogany, actually, because it is still tradable under license. But that's the problem. It's a restricted trade, and it's getting more and more restricted by the minute. So you ought to be able to buy mahogany in your lumber yard when they can get hold of it. But one of the problems is that the mahogany that is available now is not great quality on the whole, because the mahogany of the quality from Cuba and San Domingo and Jamaica and so on is just gone. And fast-grown American mahogany from Central America or South America tends to be a poorer quality. It's still available. Well, thank you.